A ship in Egypt cuts 3 weeks off a trip from Singapore to Rotterdam. It saves fuel, saves time, saves money. Simple ditch in the desert, connecting two seas, letting cargo skip the entire continent of Africa. Sounds simple. It is not. Underneath that ditch is a pricing system with no fixed rate card, a political chokehold worth billions a year, a security apparatus watching 600 ships a week, and one single point of failure that can freeze a fifth of the planet's shipping in under an hour. By the end of this, you'll understand why a canal barely wider than a football field is long can decide whether store shelves in Ohio stay stocked. Start with scale, because the numbers here don't feel real until you hear them stacked up. The Suez Canal is about 120 miles long. No locks. It's a sea-level cut, so ships don't rise or fall, they just glide through a trench dug across the Egyptian desert. Roughly 12% of all global trade by volume moves through that trench. Some years, closer to a third of all the world's shipping containers pass through it. On a normal day, 40 to 50 vessels transit. Each one can be carrying anywhere from a few $100 million to over $1 billion of cargo. Multiply that out, and on any given afternoon, the canal is holding tens of billions of dollars of goods in transit at once, in a channel that in places is only about 200 meters wide. Here's the part almost nobody outside shipping knows. The toll a ship pays to use the canal isn't a fixed number pulled from a price list. It's calculated using something called Suez Canal net tonnage, a measurement of a vessel's usable cargo space that is almost never the same figure used anywhere else in the shipping industry. Ships get measured, remeasured, and assigned a certificate specific to this one canal. Then, on top of that baseline, the Suez Canal Authority, the Egyptian state body that owns and runs the whole operation, negotiates discounts, case by case, ship by ship, sometimes route by route. A container line moving thousands of boxes a year might get a quiet rebate to keep using Suez instead of routing around Africa. It's part toll booth, part boardroom negotiation, and the sticker price is basically theoretical. The real price is whatever Cairo decides makes sense that month. Now break down what's actually flowing through that price tag, layer by layer, because it's not one homogeneous river of ships. Layer 1 is container traffic. The boxes carrying everything from sneakers to electronics to furniture, headed mostly from Asia to Europe. This is the highest value cargo per ship, and the segment that gets the most headlines when something goes wrong. Layer 2 is energy. Oil tankers and, increasingly, liquefied natural gas carriers move through Suez, linking Gulf producers to European and Asian buyers. Energy shipments through the canal and its parallel pipeline system have at various points represented close to 10% of global seaborne oil trade. Layer 3 is bulk cargo, grain, ore, fertilizer, the unglamorous stuff that doesn't make the news but keeps food prices and construction stable across 3 continents. Layer 4, and this is the one people forget, is the toll revenue itself as a line item in Egypt's national budget. In a strong year, the canal has generated close to $9 billion for the Egyptian state. That's not a private company's revenue. That money funds part of a national government. It's one of Egypt's largest sources of foreign currency, alongside tourism and remittances. So when you ask, what is the Suez Canal worth? The honest answer depends on which layer you're asking about. Cargo value in transit, toll revenue collected, or strategic value to a government that depends on it. Now flip to the costs. Because a sea-level canal cutting through shifting desert doesn't maintain itself. Dredging is constant. Sand blows in, silt builds up, and the channel has to be continuously deepened and widened just to keep pace with ever larger ships. In 2015, Egypt spent around $8 billion digging a new parallel channel, a second lane for about half the canal's length, specifically so ships could pass each other without waiting for a single-file convoy system to clear. That convoy system has its own cost. Historically, ships move through Suez in scheduled northbound and southbound convoys, sometimes waiting hours at anchorage before their turn. Every hour a container ship sits idle costs the operator real money in charter fees, and that cost gets passed downstream to every importer waiting on that cargo. Then there's security. The canal runs through the Sinai, a region that has seen serious instability. Protecting 50 ships a day moving through a fixed, predictable, narrow channel is a permanent military and intelligence commitment, not a one-time expense. And now, since late 2023, there's an entirely new cost that didn't used to exist at this scale: rerouting risk. Attacks on shipping in the nearby Red Sea by Houthi forces in Yemen pushed a large share of container traffic to abandon Suez altogether and sail around the Cape of Good Hope instead, adding roughly 10 to 14 days and enormous fuel costs to each voyage, just to avoid the approach to the canal. Egypt's own canal revenue reportedly dropped by more than half in the year that followed. That's the number that makes this whole system sound harder than it looks from a map. A canal can be operating at full technical capacity and still lose most of its business overnight. Because the danger isn't inside the canal, it's in the water leading up to it. Which brings us to the actual structural weak point. And it's not what people assume. It's not the canal running dry or Egypt shutting it down for political leverage. It's width. For most of its length, Suez is a single navigable channel. One ship, run aground sideways, can physically block the entire waterway. There's no shoulder to pull onto, no alternate lane for most of the route. And because roughly 12% of global trade depends on this one channel staying open, a blockage doesn't stay a local problem. It cascades. Container ships scheduled to unload in Rotterdam are suddenly stuck behind a jam in Egypt. Factories in Europe waiting on parts from Asia run out of inventory. Retailers miscalculate restocking schedules for products that are sitting motionless in the desert instead of on the water. One grounded ship becomes a global supply chain problem within days, because the entire system was built assuming the channel would always be passable. That's not hypothetical. It happened. In March of 2021, a container ship called the Ever Given, roughly the length of the Empire State Building lying on its side, was transiting Suez during high winds and lost steering control. It swung sideways and wedged itself diagonally across the canal. Bow and stern both jammed into the banks. For 6 days, nothing could pass. Not one ship. Backed up traffic stacked up on both ends of the canal. Hundreds of vessels waiting, carrying everything from crude oil to consumer electronics to livestock. Estimates at the time put the value of trade held up by the blockage at somewhere around $9 to $10 billion a day. Tugboats and dredgers worked around the clock, and eventually, helped by a natural high tide, the Ever Given was refloated and freed. But the story didn't end there. Egyptian authorities detained the ship for weeks afterward in a dispute over compensation for the blockage and the cost of the salvage operation, before a settlement was eventually reached with the ship's owners and insurers. One ship, one steering failure, one stretch of desert wind, and a meaningful chunk of global trade sat parked for the better part of a week. That's the entire lesson of the canal in miniature. Enormous efficiency, built on almost zero margin for error. Zoom out. And the bigger trend reshaping this whole industry is the shift from, is the canal open, to, is the canal safe? For 150 years, the core risk question for Suez was engineering and geography. Could the channel handle the ship? Now it's geopolitical. Will something outside the canal itself make shipping lines avoid it regardless of whether it's physically passable? The Red Sea attacks proved that a canal can be fully operational and still lose the bulk of its business. Because insurers and shipping companies aren't just calculating transit time anymore, they're calculating risk exposure for the entire approach route. That's a new kind of vulnerability for a piece of infrastructure that used to be judged purely on depth, width, and dredging schedules. Now look at how thin the line actually is between a good year for the canal and a bad one. In a good year, traffic runs near capacity, ships pay their tolls, Egypt books close to $9 billion in revenue, and the canal quietly does its job as the fastest route between Asia and Europe. In a bad year, say, the one following the Red Sea attacks, a large share of that container traffic reroutes around Africa instead. Revenue falls by more than half. Transit times for diverted ships stretch out by nearly 2 weeks each way, and fuel costs for the industry balloon into the billions. The physical canal doesn't change at all between those two scenarios. Same width, same depth, same dredging schedule. What changes is confidence. A shipping line's decision to use Suez or avoid it is really a bet on stability in a region the canal doesn't control. And that bet can flip in a matter of weeks, based on events hundreds of miles from the water itself. So why does anyone stay committed to a choke point this fragile? For shipping companies, the answer is blunt math. Even with insurance premiums and war risk surcharges factored in, Suez is often still cheaper and faster than the alternative, as long as the danger stays below a certain threshold. Time is money in container shipping, and 2 extra weeks around Africa isn't a rounding error, it's a scheduling catastrophe for lines running tight delivery windows. For Egypt, the incentive runs even deeper than shipping tolls. The canal isn't just a revenue line, it's leverage. It gives Egypt a permanent seat at the table in any conversation about global trade, energy security, and Middle East stability, regardless of the country's size or military weight otherwise. Losing traffic hurts the budget, but the canal's strategic value as a piece of geography that great powers can't route around doesn't disappear just because a few ships take the long way home. That's why Egypt poured billions into widening it even during periods of lower traffic. The goal isn't just efficiency, it's making sure that when ships do come back, there's more capacity waiting, and Egypt's grip on this corridor stays as tight as it's ever been. So go back to that first image, a shortcut through the desert, saving 3 weeks on a trip from Asia to Europe. That's true. It's also the least interesting thing about the canal. What actually determines whether 12% of world trade keeps flowing isn't the depth of the channel or the size of the ships. It's a tonnage formula nobody outside shipping has heard of, a single lane with no shoulder to pull onto, a government balancing tolls against geopolitics, and a security picture hundreds of miles away that can empty the canal without a single grain of sand moving. The Suez Canal isn't really about a shortcut through the desert. It's about how much of the modern world runs through a channel 200 meters wide, with no backup plan if it closes.